Welcome, everybody, to TMD On The Record. I'm your host, Dave Cliche. This is my friend and colleague, Jeff Timmins. And we've got an interesting conversation for today, don't we? Something a little bit different, not quite what we've done in the past, but I am really excited for this discussion.
Me too, Dave. I'm excited to be here with you talking again. And it's a great conversation we're going to have today.
Well, let's get started.
All right. So a few days ago, let's call it a few days ago, recently, I receive a notification or an email from a very well-established university here in Canada. They are running a new program on accessibility and accessibility in the workplace and how important it is for brands and corporations to be able to serve, let's call it their stakeholders or their customers, and be accessible to them. Here's the thing. The email I received and the website that it directs you to is not compliant to the basic rules of accessibility.
Right. So it was not AOTA compliant.
Was not AOTA compliant.
Interesting.
And, I went and took it to our team and had a look at it, and they absolutely went through the laundry list of the failures of this specific piece. And it got us thinking about the responsibility brands and corporations have to be accessible to those who really need it. And it is a responsibility. It's not something you should be choosing to do. It is something that you have to do.
Yep.
And so it also got me thinking about a good friend of mine. And this friend of mine, not only, well, first off, we're really excited to have her on the show.
Absolutely.
We have not had a lot of guests in person on the show, and she's actually virtual today. So She sees us on screen, we see her on screen. But not only is she a very accomplished whitewater kayaker, not only is she a wonderful marketer who, frankly, and don't be offended, Dave, I've probably learned more from her than I have any other marketer I've ever worked with. And on top of that, she is just a wonderful person. So today we would like to welcome to our show my good friend, Mandy.
Welcome, Mandy.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And Jeff, right back at you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And
we had a lot of fun working together and with each other over several years in our careers and in personal lives. So really excited to have you here today. And can you see my socks?
I can't see your socks. Hold your feet up higher.
Can you see that? Can you see those?
Yeah.
Those are from, they're from an airport that you and I used to frequent. It's from the carpet on the airport. Do you remember that? Okay, anyhow, long story short. Completely irrelevant to anybody watching or listening. This is just between Mandy and I and the travels that we used to get to do together. So they are a socks I'm wearing are a replica of the pattern that were in this airport. So anyhow,
it's actually a very fascinating marketing tactic that they did to use their carpet as their brand strategy for the airport.
And that might actually be a future podcast topic.
Quite possibly, because we know how attractive airport carpeting is as a rule, right? So for those of you that are listening and
it's a great example of using something that is unusual to identify your brand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, listen, why don't we jump into this? Because, we don't want to take up too much time of those listening and of yourself. But again, we're super grateful you're here with us today. And why don't we start with a little bit of your background and aside from our personal connection, why we're talking with you today about accessibility in particular, and share what you wish of your story and your background to kind of set it up for those who are listening.
Sure. Yeah. I've spent the past 30 years of my career in marketing communications. As Jeff mentioned, I spent 10 years at working together at Columbia Sportswear, where I was the director of marketing for the U.S. And most recently was a head of communications and events for a college. And during the pandemic, I went deaf. So now I am a late deafened adult. I happen to have a cochlear implant. I don't know if a lot of people who are listening actually know what a cochlear implant is, but it's a surgically implanted device that is enabling me to hear you today and be on this podcast. I have a microphone that is actually picking up the audio and streaming it directly into my implant. So it's a great example of how technology is enabling access. So when, Jeff, you reached out to me about doing this podcast, I was certainly excited about it because having gone through this experience has certainly made me much more aware of how important it is to consider accessibility in your marketing communications, because I've certainly experienced it firsthand how much of a challenge it can be.
Yeah, and frankly, we experienced it today too. Bree and myself tried to get our production set up here today. How difficult and not user friendly accessibility settings are in trying to do a virtual podcast.
I think it took us 30 minutes, Jeff, to actually figure out how to turn on the captioning. So I don't think you all can see it on your end, but I have captions turned on my end. But for when you're using Zoom, the person who sets up the actual Zoom has to enable that functionality, which is a little weird. It should be on the user end, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zoom, if you're listening or watching, there's a little bug for you to fix. But I think it really talks about or speaks to the fact that brands don't do enough, and they certainly take this, what we're talking about today, for granted. Maybe talk to us, Mandy, a little bit about this accessibility thing. First off, is broad. It touches a lot more people than I think brands realize, which is maybe why brands don't put enough effort into it. If they realized how many people are impacted, they might put a little more effort into it. And frankly, they should anyways. But maybe talk to us a little bit about what accessible marketing is, and this is new to you. So this is fresh. Well,
first, answer your first question related to how big is the market. I've seen figures as large as close to 1 billion people worldwide who identify as having a disability. At the end of the day, if you think about it, if you get old enough, you're going to experience a disability yourself.
And our population is aging.
Dave, you have glasses on, right?
I do. Yeah.
There's a broad range of what a disability can be, right? So physical, it can be cognitive, it can be auditory, it can be visual, it can be permanent, it can be temporary. That's something that I've really thought about in terms of how important it is to consider accessibility in your marketing communications. Because if you think about temporary disabilities, Jeff, I know you have kids.
Yeah.
When you're running around and when they were babies and you're holding them in your arms and you're trying to get the coffee made and you're trying to use your computer, right? Like, thank goodness for voice control then, right? And would voice control have been as advanced today if we didn't have the need for creating accessible components in technology, right?
Good point. And the need created it.
Once you slow down and really think about the reach of what we're talking about when we talk about accessibility, it's really broad.
I'm going to call you a wonderful marketer, very strategic, very creative. In given your current situation, what are the kind of tactics that marketers or brands should be using, in particular and we can even just talk about it from a hearing perspective, but what are the things that marketers should be doing or considering, in this kind of situation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's a pretty broad question. There's tactical elements, right? There's the things that you can create a checklist for. When you create a video, have you enabled captioning? Are you being mindful of the music background, overlaying with people speaking, those kinds of things. There's on the web, in terms of web accessibility, of course, there's these checklists that you can go through to make sure that you're complying with standards, laws such as ADA. But I think from a bigger picture standpoint, really thinking about how you can incorporate a strategic mindset as it relates to inclusive design, right? So look at it less as a checklist and more as a mindset. Jeff, I recently, and just thinking about this podcast, I went on to Google's accessibility website. They have a it's a toolkit, a marketing toolkit, and I really encourage your team to check it out because it's just beautifully laid out, very just clear in terms of how do you create an inclusive design strategy, building the right team, making inclusive design choices, and holding each other accountable. It really takes what can be overwhelming in this space and simplifies it in a way that feels less intimidating.
I love some of your perspective here around to really, like, there's the tactical checklist, but the reality is you have to start with this mindset, this consideration of, are you thinking about accessibility from the start? I relate it almost, or equate it almost to when, that transition between building websites that were for desktop and websites that were for mobile and starting to build for mobile first. You have to at least have that mindset that, is this going to work for mobile? And technology evolved, like you said, it evolved for websites to be mobile responsive. And, technology has evolved to be able to enable accessibility, but you still need the people who are starting with the strategy to have that mindset of accessibility first.
Well, what I like about what Mandy was saying too is it's a choice, right? You make a choice. And I think one of the things we chatted about before we went live with this was the blurred background. And I thought what you said was incredibly insightful. Not that you're trying to hide your kitchen from us, because when I blur my background, it is a choice that I've made because of what's behind me, right? So like I usually blur my background. It's like, oh my God, I've got stuff all over the place. I don't want everyone to think that I'm an absolute slob and a chaotic disaster. But what I hadn't thought about, Mandy, was what you said about, it's actually better for the viewer because there's less of a distraction and it allows them to focus on you in this case and what you're saying and the expressions on your face, the nonverbal communications, without, maybe pets and partners and kids and all kinds of, clutter and stuff in the background. But what it got me thinking about is it's one of the core fundamentals of communication. Isn't it supposed to be about who's receiving the communication and making sure we're doing everything we can to position them to be able to digest, understand, comprehend what it is that we're delivering? And I just thought that was the blurred background on a Zoom call is a perfect example of how it's not for us as the one who might be communicating, it's for those that might be receiving the information and making it easier for them to comprehend.
Dave, that's a really great, I appreciate you bringing that up. Something that I have personally experienced in going deaf is just, I recognize how much lip reading I do, right? And you probably experienced this during the pandemic when we were all wearing face masks. You probably were like, wow, I actually read a lot of lips too, right? Like we communicate with our, there's a lot that goes on in our mouth area, right? So if we cover that up, we're losing a lot of, ability to understand each other. So
you and I had a conversation a few weeks back, and it was the first time that we had been on screen since you had gone deaf. And honestly, I was a little nervous because I wasn't really sure, like, Mandy's gone deaf. How is she going to hear me? Right? So one of the first, I asked you, I said, what do you need from me? And one of the things you said to me, which really resonated, because it connects to something that my grandfather told me years ago, is just make sure you're looking at the camera. Make sure I can see your lips. And it goes back to, my grandfather used to say, if you really want to communicate with someone, make sure they can see your face and see your eyes. So you're looking directly at them. If you're looking down or away, they won't be able to truly understand you. And from from an accessibility perspective, little things like, I say little, but little things as in look directly in the camera so people can read your lips and see your expressions is really important. And that's not something that may be on a checklist, but it is how, from a creative standpoint, you can make it work. So I just started to think about some of these things, even as we get this set up today, and maybe we could talk a little bit about what is it that you need or you want brands to give you so that you can interact with them and engage with them better.
Being deaf, there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's a broad spectrum, deaf to hard of hearing. There's people who are deaf with cochlear implants. There's people who are deaf who don't have cochlear implants that rely on sign language. So asking somebody what they need is huge. And that's a big element of accessibility. You did a great thing by doing that. And so sometimes it can feel intimidating, right? This is a space that, that we're not accustomed, unfortunately, to talk about openly, but we've got to. So I appreciate that you asked, right? What are my specific needs? And talk about event marketing. That's a huge thing too. When you're hosting an event, ask your customers what they need. And have them, maybe some might need ASL interpreters and maybe some, I'm just throwing that out there. Anyway, I forget what your question was, but I just wanted to highlight that. That's a big piece of accessibility.
I just think, maybe we go down this road of like, what are there brands that are doing this well? Any brands that you interact with or brands that are giving you what you need? Or brands that you see that are doing, let's call it accessibility well?
It's a really good question. And I as it relates to being deaf, one brand in particular really jumps out. And it's an unusual brand actually for me to bring up, but it's Starbucks. So Starbucks, I don't know if you saw that back in 2018, they opened a store near a university, Gallaudet University, which is a deaf and hard of hearing, pretty famous university in the United States in Washington, D.C. And so Starbucks opened a store in that marketplace. And they partnered with deaf and hard of hearing people, to create the store environment, to service those customers. Like little details too, on the aprons, they have embroidered Starbucks in ASL lettering. They hired a deaf artist to create their mugs. And so it was the first mass. Then they, of course, did a huge PR campaign around it. And it was the first time I remember seeing a brand go that deep, if that makes sense, in terms of reaching the deaf and hard of hearing community. But even beyond that, mass media plays a huge role in breaking down stereotypes, and also biases. And so, or can play a big, I don't know, they can also play a barrier, right? But in terms of this, what Starbucks did, it was a pretty big deal.
Well, and I know you like DC, so that would be great for you to go. There's a reason for you to go there. And it's a great example. And you also gave an earlier example, which I really liked, which is what Google did for their accessibility. So certainly any listeners out there, that's something you should, if you are building marketing communications, you should be using those kind of tools and asking those questions of your brands and of your teammates to be able to service this. Is there anything in particular you would like to see more of?
I'd like to see more people with disabilities on marketing and product teams. So including, them in the hiring, right? Or And second, representation in the campaigns themselves.
Absolutely. Well, and this is fairly new, and as I mentioned, and you've mentioned, fairly new and fresh for you. For someone who maybe is engaging with this or knows someone who's engaging with it, like where do you go to learn? Where do you go to start to figure these things out beyond your own curiosity?
There's so many places, right? You Google accessibility and, it becomes overwhelming. And so first I want to say, start where you are, do what you can, right? That old saying, really try not to get overwhelmed. I think if I were, starting out, I would go to the big brands that I've mentioned. Google, Microsoft also has just a beautifully done DEI, including accessibility. But there's, for marketers, of course, there's the ADA standards for accessible design. I would absolutely read the National Center on Disability Journalism, Disability Language Style Guide. So one of the things, Jeff, that I'm sensitive to, and I know you are too, is how do we talk about disability, respectfully? And, it's hard. We're not, some of us, before becoming deaf myself, I wasn't aware of a lot of the terminology. The web content accessibility guidelines, there's checklists for marketers. You can go there. There's tons of classes. I think for me, I think it starts with a place of curiosity. Just the other day, for example, how many times have you been in the shower and you're trying to read your shampoo bottle, right? And this shampoo bottle, not only is the font small,